Okay, let's start. So, thank you very much and welcome everybody. Thank you very much to be here today. My name is Jean-Michel Marin. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Sciences, and it's a very great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Peter Reich, one of the most respected and influential scientists in ecology and evolution. So thank you very much, Peter, to be here today and also tomorrow. Your research has transformed our understanding on how ecosystems respond to climate change and how biodiversity supports the resilience of life on Earth. Adam will introduce Peter in more detail. What I would like to say is that at the University of Montpellier, ecology is more than a discipline. It's a form of a meeting point between all disciplines. Many of our research team work together to understand how life adapts to change, from gene to ecosystem and from molecule to the biosphere. I am myself a mathematician working closely with population geneticists, and in some way a kind of creature of the University of Montpellier, born from this tradition of crossing discipline to understand how evolution and environment interact. So your presence here is very important for us because, as you know, ecology is one of the main fields of the University of Montpellier and more and all these partners. So Peter talks today, his title, Can We Justly Use Nature to Fight Climate Change? Okay, a very inspiring title. And before you begin, I would like to share few questions that this title inspired to me, and then I give the end to Adam. Can we really use nature as a tool to fix the climate when it is itself a network of complex interactions that we still only partially understand? First, can we truly use nature fairly when climate change already creates so much inequality among people and among species? You can develop for sure, and I am very interested to have your vision on this. And if our survival depends now on nature, does acting with nature mean changing not only our method but also our mindset? Let's think about that. So thank you very much, Peter, for being with us today. We are very honored and eager to hear your vision. So thank you, and I give the end to Adam.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. So I will just make some words mostly in French, in order to be sure that all people catch the main information that I can give according to Peter and his long career in the field of ecology and evolutions. So for me, it's for sure is a great pleasure to have Peter with us today. So just to have some words about his long life of research. So, donc, mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, chers étudiants et chers étudiants, donc c'est un immense plaisir et un honneur, au nom de la Faculté des Sciences, comme l'a pu le dire notre doyen, et de l'Université de Montpellier, d'ouvrir ce cycle de conférences exceptionnelles. En accueillant aujourd'hui donc le professeur Peter Reich, donc un des écologues les plus influents de notre temps. Donc Peter Reich est professeur à l'université du Minnesota et de l'université de Bond en Australie, donc double casquette. Donc son parcours scientifique illustre à merveille ce que la curiosité, la rigueur scientifique et l'ouverture peuvent produire lorsque la science se met au service de la société. Donc son œuvre a à la fois croisé l'écologie des forêts, du changement climatique, la biodiversité a profondément transformé notre compréhension, moi-même étant écologue dans ce domaine, donc du fonctionnement des écosystèmes terrestres. Donc il a été formé à Yale, mais aussi à Cornell. Donc il a consacré plus de 4 décennies à explorer le lien entre climat, sol, séquestration, donc flux de carbone dans la végétation. Il est l'auteur de plus de 700 articles de rang A. Donc, je vous laisse imaginer la production scientifique de Peter. Donc, dans notre domaine, c'est quand même assez hors du commun. plus de 200 citations. Encore une fois, ça montre, je dirais, la productivité et la reconnaissance de ces travaux de recherche sur le plan international. Donc, on peut considérer que c'est un des scientifiques, des chercheurs les plus influents de notre monde dans le domaine de l'écologie et des sciences de l'environnement. Ce qui rend aussi Peter unique, c'est sa capacité à combiner à la fois des aspects de sciences fondamentales, mais aussi des aspects pédagogiques. Donc, je vous invite à aller sur la chaîne de vulgarisation qui s'appelle MinuteEarth, qui transforme les concepts parfois compliqués d'écologie en récits accessibles, drôles, inspirants pour le grand public. Donc, il a vraiment cette passion depuis très longtemps de pouvoir transformer ce qu'il peut, je dirais, découvrir dans le monde scientifique complexe en une forme de pédagogie pour le grand public. Merci encore une fois, Peter, pour cette transmission. Donc, il a donc cette double passion, recherche et transmission. C'est ce qui vraiment anime Peter durant toute sa carrière. Donc ici, à Montpellier, donc on cultive aussi cette passion pour la transmission. Et donc naturellement, donc le fait que Peter nous rejoigne aujourd'hui pour ce cycle de conférences s'aligne finalement sur cette direction-là. Notre capacité aussi à pouvoir transmettre et à faire en sorte que dans un monde où les choses changent rapidement, qu'on puisse aussi avoir aussi je dirais, nous les chercheurs, cette notion de transmission, c'est de notre responsabilité. Donc, je dirais que ces travaux ont démontré la diversité biologique n'est pas un luxe, ok, c'est vraiment pas un luxe de la nature, mais un fondement de sa stabilité et de sa résilience. Donc, on est vraiment au cœur du problème, notamment face au changement global. Donc, avec un monde qui est confronté à une crise climatique qui est de plus en plus, je dirais, profond, qui nous impacte au quotidien. Donc, on vient d'apprendre que de toute façon, que l'objectif de contenir l'augmentation des températures à 1,5 degré, c'est fini. On n'est plus dans ce range-là. Donc, on voit que la situation s'accélère et se dégrade malheureusement. Donc, il y a une forme d'urgence particulière qui est à notre porte. Donc, à travers de ces travaux, Peter Reich nous rappelle donc que la forêt, ces grands régulateurs du climat, ne sont pas seulement des puits de carbone, ce sont aussi des communautés vivantes et des archives du passé et des promesses d'avenir. Donc, même sur ce diaporama complexe, pas forcément, je dirais, joyeux, il y a quand même une lueur d'espoir. Et Peter souhaite, je dirais, dans ses interventions, donc, donner cet espoir que rien n'est totalement, je dirais, terminé, qu'on peut lutter, qu'on doit lutter. Donc, un petit message à nos chers étudiants et étudiantes. Donc, j'espère que cette conférence sera pour vous une source d'inspiration, que vous reteniez de cette rencontre non seulement des connaissances, mais aussi une attitude, la curiosité. C'est ce qui anime avant tout notre communauté, la rigueur, la conviction que la science peut et doit contribuer à un monde plus durable et plus juste. D'ailleurs, avant de commencer, donc Peter, on va passer une petite vidéo que nous allons diffuser, une courte vidéo, pardon, donc réalisée par les étudiants du Master Bois, qui parcourent depuis plusieurs mois les forêts d'Europe. Donc un petit message à la fois pour Peter, mais aussi pour notre public. Encore une fois, merci Peter d'avoir accepté notre invitation et bienvenue à Montpellier, dans cette université qui partage vos valeurs d'ouverture et de curiosité et de passion pour la nature. Merci à toutes et à tous.
Bonjour à toutes et tous, nous sommes Maxence, Antoine et Yannick, tous les trois anciens étudiants du Master Sciences du Bois. Avec notre association, les Rayons Ligneux, nous réalisons un documentaire.
L'idée du documentaire est née durant notre dernière année d'études. On voulait faire un voyage à vélo à travers l'Europe, mais on voulait surtout donner un sens à ce voyage. Donc c'est assez naturellement que le sujet du changement climatique est venu à nous, parce que c'est un sujet qu'on étudie, qu'on vit et qu'on ressent tous les jours.
Alors on a choisi de parler de la forêt, parce que c'est un écosystème qu'on connaît bien, et qu'il reflète les effets du changement climatique. À travers ce film, on veut comprendre ce qui se joue derrière les forêts européennes, comment elles changent, et comment les humains réagissent.
Depuis qu'on est parti début octobre, on pédale, on filme, on rencontre des chercheuses, des chercheurs, des forestiers, des propriétaires, des artisans du bois, toutes les personnes qui, à leur manière, œuvrent à l'avenir des forêts.
Depuis Paris, nous avons mis le cap vers l'est. Nous avons traversé les Vosges pour aller en Allemagne, puis sommes descendus à travers la forêt noire pour rejoindre la Suisse. Notre but, c'est de montrer que derrière les constats alarmants, il y a aussi des actions, des solutions et des gens qui gardent espoir.
On veut redonner envie aux gens de s'intéresser à la forêt, leur permettre de comprendre comment elle fonctionne, pour pouvoir mieux la protéger.
Alors pendant que vous serez en train d'écouter Peter Reich parler du changement climatique, nous serons quelque part entre la Suisse et l'Italie à filmer les forêts qui en portent déjà les marques. On espère, à travers ce documentaire, que vous aurez, vous aussi, envie de regarder les forêts autrement.
Bonjour. Je voudrais dire merci à professeur Ali et à l'université pour m'inviter. Et je demande vous m'excuser pour donner mon conférence en anglais au lieu de français. So I'll switch to a language I speak much better. And I'm going to talk today about whether we can use nature to fight climate change. And actually, hopefully I will address the three questions you asked, which are very challenging and complex questions for society in order for us to use nature at all to fight climate change. Now, fighting climate change is only one of dozens of nature-based solutions that people have thought about to our many global change challenges. But I've chosen to focus on it today, well, first, because I only have an hour, and second, because I think it's the most important, because all of those other services and solutions will be useless if we don't stop climate change. Much of my talk today will fall in the realm of my traditional ecosystem science, the kind of work I've been doing for decades. But I'm hoping to add a little bit about justice considerations, as many of us in ecology around the world are starting to try to think about ecology as nested within other elements of society, not as an isolated thing. And at the end, also, I'll spend a little time talking about whether we can place our nature-based solutions and ecosystems in a broader societal framework, along with other decarbonization kinds of solutions that are outside of the ecological realm. Now, why is this necessary? Well, as everyone in this room knows, the Earth has warmed by more than 1 degree C since 1900. And by 2025, almost every biome and its people are struggling with climate change. And by 2060, climate change will reduce global well-being every year by as much as the worst years on record, World War II, the Great Depression. Well, who makes this claim about what's happening in 2060? Is it an environmentalist, an ecologist like me? No, it's actually the world's largest reinsurance company, Swiss Re, who in one of their many reports comes up with this conclusion because it's in their business interest to understand risk and future risk. And their assessment of future risk is actually more dire than most ecologists. So what is the role of nature in climate change so far or in the future? So I'll start with this simple cartoon of where do carbon emissions end up and what's the role of nature? Now, if we look at the cumulative emissions, 90% or so of which are from fossil fuel burning and 10% or so from land use change, over the last 60 years, only 44%, and that's pretty much year by year, have stayed in the atmosphere. The oceans and the land ecosystems have scrubbed or removed 56% of the garbage we've put in the atmosphere. That's pretty amazing. So the Earth is warmed by 1 degree C, but without these oceanic and land sink services, the Earth would have already warmed by 2 to 2.5 degrees C. So I'm going to share a story in 2 parts. First, can we enhance this quadrillion euro or dollar service, and can we do so justly? And then can we combine what we do on the land with decarbonization in other sectors? And again, can that be done with justice in mind? So I use this cartoon to think about the connections that we're going to cross over today, the way in which climate influences biodiversity and ecosystem function, the way in which society changes climate, the way all of these interweave and interconnect with each other. So what is it we really need to know? And I'll hope to cover much of this today. What's going to happen to ecosystems as we continue to change climate? What's going to happen to climate as we change ecosystems and also as we continue to pollute? How will all this influence people and nature and their interaction? What should we do to tweak the dials to optimize our future? And how on earth do we make that happen? And the last one is, of course, I think the hardest one of all. So I'm going to start here with the first part, whether we can enhance this quadrillion-dollar service of climate regulation that nature has already played. Now, because I don't know much about oceans and have studied land, I'm just going to focus on the land part of that carbon sink sequestration and climate regulation. I'm going to touch upon 4 questions in the next 30 or 40 minutes. How does climate change impact on ecosystem function and on biodiversity? In turn, how does biodiversity affect ecosystem function? And lastly, when you keep those 3 things in mind, what does that mean for potential natural climate solutions? Now, for this talk, when I say biodiversity, I'm including things like community assembly and community composition, not just diversity metrics per se, like species richness or Shannon's diversity. And also, I'm generally talking about the level of local diversity in a field or in a forest stand, where we're really talking about the simplification of the community at that level. So local extinction, but not species extinctions per se, which are important, but really is a different question in many respects. Now, a slight tangent here. I want to introduce what I've called the 1% rule, which is the premise for why nature-based solutions to climate are even worth talking about. And this is because there's 4 times as much carbon in soils and plants as there is in the atmosphere. And the exchange between the atmosphere and the land biosphere is very dynamic. I think 1 out of every 7 molecules of CO2 in the atmosphere is photosynthesized every year. And there's 300 times as much carbon in the soil and plants as are emitted by humans each year. So if we could change 1/300th of, or enhance by 1/300th the amount of carbon in soil and plants each year, that would offset all of our emissions. So there's this huge reservoir of carbon in soils and plants that we have at least out there as a potential way of trying to sequester some additional carbon. And so one way to think about this is a 1% increase in global productivity, GPP, photosynthesis globally, and a 1% decrease in how much CO2 we send back to the atmosphere through soil respiration and wildfire, that would offset 1/5 of annual emissions. Now, if anyone in this room has ever measured anything in the field or even in the laboratory with 1% precision, please raise your hand. I don't see any hands raised. Mine's not raised either. So we basically are asking to change something that we can't even detect. It's below our detection level. And that small a change done globally would actually be really important. But that's the challenge, is that this has to be done in every kind of system, agricultural, forest, grassland, desert. and it has to be done everywhere on Earth in order for it to actually add up. So, the first question is climate change impacts on ecosystem function and biodiversity, because we need our ecosystems and biodiversity to be functional to have any chance of sequestering more carbon. So what's happened so far? Well, we actually know quite a bit about this because people are studying this in tundra and in grasslands and in deserts and in forests, temperate and tropical. And again, because I only have an hour, I'm just going to focus on one system, one I've worked in a lot, the boreal forests, places like most of Canada, a little bit of northern United States, Scandinavia, Russia. Canada 2 years ago had extreme wildfire years. They broke their prior record by 5 times. On the right, upper right, you see all the fires that were going on in one single day in 2023. So wildfires driven by climate change are going to be an enormous issue and problem for vegetation and ecosystems everywhere on Earth. But I'm going to ignore wildfires because even ignoring wildfires, climate warming already harms ecosystems, even in cold, wet environments like the boreal forest. And that's largely due to the drying of air and soil from higher temperatures and lower vapor pressure deficit or drier air, which causes greater evapotranspiration, which means soils dry out. So I'm going to give a couple of slides of data about this, starting with a very localized experiment, one we call Before Warmed. We've been running this open air warming and increased VPD experiment for 15 years at 2 sites in northern Minnesota, which is at the ecotone between temperate and boreal forests. Open air, no chambers. We raised temperatures by 1.5 or 3 degrees Celsius. I'm going to show one slide from this experiment where in one of several experiments with different cohorts of planted seedlings, over these 5 years, we see that if you look at the red arrows going downward, that for 2 dominant species, balsam fir and white spruce, that their growth, as you can see on the top, and their survival are going downhill with even 1.5 degrees warming over 5 years by quite a lot. And many of the other species also do quite poorly. So it doesn't take a lot of warming to have a big impact in the system. And as I mentioned, this is mostly, it's not due to high temperatures having a physiological, being a physiological problem for the trees. It's due to the drying that's associated with warming. Actually, I lied. This is the second figure from this study. We can see here that for 10 different species averaged across a number of years, as soils dry, so you go from 95th percentile to wet periods, rained a lot, to 50th percentile to dry period, 5th percentile, that photosynthesis in both the warmed and unwarmed treatments, both bars, declines because plants close their stomates, the pores on their leaves that prevent water loss when soils are dry. But what we see, what difference is that when the soils are wet, you get a benefit from warming. It's a cool part of the world. You get a 15% enhancement in productivity. But as you dry, once you even get to 50% the average soil moisture, you've already lost 10% of your productivity because the plants close their stomates because of the dry soils. And as it gets drier, this problem gets worse. So the same exact climate change actually has benefits for the plants during rainy periods and negative effects when it's dry. And in total, on average, those effects tend to be negative. Now, our data from our very small scale experiment, but very high-tech experiment outdoors, is completely consistent with observations across all of Canada's boreal forests. Going from the 1965 to 2010 or so, growth across the whole forest has declined. Tree mortality has increased with all of the species. So the same kinds of things we're seeing in our experiment are being observed across Canada. And another kind of data, working with Martin Girardin's group, using treeing data from across all of Canada, we look at the drying of the air independently of soil moisture or temperature effects already reduces tree growth, not just in the future, but already has. So the way to look at this figure for these black and white spruce species is anywhere that you see blue colors on the map, that's where drier air, meaning years and months with higher vapor pressure deficit, lower humidity in the atmosphere, are increasing tree growth. Everywhere that you see red, dry air is reducing tree growth. Doesn't take a genius to see that almost everywhere is red and that the dry air is causing growth reductions for both of these species. And the mechanism actually is very, very simple. As I mentioned a few minutes ago about stomatal conductance, almost every higher plant on Earth that has stomates closes them when the air is drier in order to save water. And actually, physiologists like me, and my original training was as a plant physiologist, were actually pretty slow to think about this. It wasn't until maybe 10 or so years ago that people really started to think about dry air as being a huge part of climate change impacts globally. And we see here that closed stomates, which also reduces the ability of CO2 to infiltrate into the leaf, reduces photosynthesis and growth across Canada, and probably does it in every single ecosystem on Earth in ways that we really haven't even quantified very well yet. So we've seen in this cool, wet part of the world, climate change, even independent of fires, having negative impacts. But what about biodiversity more narrowly defined, things like species richness, evenness, and the like? Well, we actually know shockingly little about global change impacts on biodiversity because everything is changing simultaneously. CO2 is changing, climate's changing, land use is changing, nitrogen deposition is changing. We actually know a lot more about land use and nitrogen deposition impacts on biodiversity than we do about carbon dioxide and climate impacts. In fact, I've never found a paper that tried to quantify globally the impact of either of these on species richness or evenness. So we have, in another one of our experiments, the opportunity to at least look in an experimental sense at the role of global change on biodiversity. This is an experiment called Can, short for temperature, rainfall, CO2, nitrogen, a sub-experiment in grasslands within our Can experiment. The Can experiment has varied species richness, CO2, nitrogen for 27 years. The sub-experiment called Can has modified temperature, rainfall, CO2, and nitrogen for 15 years, again, without chambers, on dozens of, actually hundreds of plots in total in the Can experiment at the Cedar Creek site in Minnesota. So what did we find in terms of species richness in these grassland plots that were planted with 9 species at a time from a 16 species pool? So on average across 13 years, as you look from 0 to 4 of these global changes, increasing temperature, reduced rain, elevated CO2, and increased nitrogen, what happened to species richness? Well, what we see here is in a species richness in a local neighborhood within each plot, the number of species encountered decreased from 5 down to a little more than 3 as you go from no global changes to 4. So on average, with any one of the global changes across all 4 of them, we lose about 8% of species richness across the 13 years, 16% with 2, and 35% with all 4. Some of this is due to competitive exclusion, where the dominant species outcompetes others for resources, but some is also due to some species not being able to cope with some stress from some of these global change drivers. So all of the mechanisms we see in the real world are at work in this experiment. This is one small but long-running experiment. Is this true in forests, woodlands, shrublands around the world? We actually have no idea. We think so, but we have very little data to go on. So this question of what is climate change doing to biodiversity actually is still an enormous knowledge gap for our field. So let's turn it around and look at biodiversity effects on ecosystem function. So if we think biodiversity matters for ecosystems, how do we test this? And we use both observational and experimental approaches in both forests and grasslands. I helped set up something called the Global Forest Biodiversity Initiative with Jingjing Liang, who's now at Purdue University, and Tom Crowther, and with hundreds of scientists around the world, and data from more than 80 countries' national inventories, we've done work such as looking at the relationship between biodiversity and local tree species richness within regions from the coldest to the warmest and wettest forests across the Earth. And you see this curve here, whereas you lose species richness locally or have forests with less species richness in them, productivity is lower. This is observational. Mechanisms are hard to decipher from this. So we, community of researchers around the world, have done similar studies with trees and with grasses in experiments and seen virtually the identical shape of relationships between productivity and either planted or realized richness. I mentioned the Biocon study has been going on for more than 25 years. We published a study this year led by Neha Mohan Babu, in which we saw that diversity has positive impacts on productivity under every combination of ambient and elevated CO2 or nitrogen, and that the so-called diversity dividends have grown larger over 25 years. If you look at the darkest blue color in the earliest years, you see there's a positive increase with species richness going from 1 to 16 species planted. But as you go from the blue to the green to the yellow over time, that diversity benefit gets larger and larger. This actually is not something we hypothesized. This has kind of amazed us. But there are reasons for this. Early on, you have mechanisms that kick into play immediately with, and I'll talk about some of these more tomorrow, things such as niche complementarity, niche heterogeneity, species differences in their physiology that occur right away. But things like diversity leading to increased soil fertility can take 3, 5, 10, 20, 50 years. And we think that's part of the reason why these diversity benefits are shown to get larger and larger over time in this particular experiment. And it's actually shown similarly in all the other forest experiments and grassland experiments, although not many of them have run this long. So this notion that diversity matters and it's getting stronger over time is well supported both experimentally and observationally. Now, not in every case, but the vast majority. I've been talking just about plant diversity, but the same exact questions can be asked about soil diversity. And here I'm showing one slide from a project led by Manu Delgado Bacorizo, in which we took data from grasslands, forests, shrublands across biomes across the world to look at the way in which differences in different components of soil diversity and a multi-diversity index of all of those influence various functions, including nutrient cycling, soil respiration, decomposition, etc. And you can see on the left that as you increase any kind of soil biodiversity, function of the system increases. And actually the multi-diversity black line with the steep slope shows that when you combine them all, you get the biggest bang for the buck from increase in soil diversity. So diversity matters in plants, it matters in microbes. Both of them increase productivity, and also, although I haven't shown it, they increase stability in all of these systems. So what does this all mean, thinking about climate change impacts on biodiversity and biodiversity effects on ecosystem function for natural climate solutions and their potential? Well, something that's actually really interesting to me, which I don't think we have the answer to yet, is that despite the largely negative impacts of climate change on terrestrial ecosystems, the land carbon sink has been increasing for 60 years. This is from the excellent Global Carbon Project, which I'm not a part of, but dozens of scientists around the world have contributed to over time. On the left, we show both in CO2 units and in carbon units, the land sink strength globally from this project. The y-axis, we see time in years. And what we see is that this has more than doubled since 1960. So this magnitude of the natural land sink. We don't really know why. Some people argue that it's mostly due to elevated CO2. Could be due to land use change that we really haven't accounted for as well as we think we have. My hunch is probably both. But this is actually an impressive scope of carbon sink relative to emissions. The black line there is the magnitude of the natural land sink in the 2020s. The red arrow and the black dot above it is the magnitude of our fossil fuel emissions and also our land deforestation emissions. So the natural land sink is a pretty large sink compared to our emissions. So the question is, and here's where natural climate solutions come in, is can we do better? Can we nudge that black arrow up a little higher to take a bigger bite out of the carbon emissions? People have had dozens of ideas about how to make this happen. I'm borrowing some pictures from Project Drawdown. If you're not familiar with it, they have a great website. They have maybe 25 pictures. I'm going to show 6 of them. You can use additional avoided conversion, meaning keep that carbon on the landscape if it's in a forest or a grassland or peatland. You can also protect grasslands. You can restore tropical forests. You can have conservation agriculture of various kinds. You can use tree intercropping, and you can use tree plantations on degraded land, for instance. But many people who are skeptical say, well, this sounds great, but is there actually enough potential to acquire more carbon from the air and to store more carbon in the ecosystem? I'm going to show briefly about the acquisition part of this. Here's a study led by César Terrer, who's now at MIT. We pulled together data from 108 experiments with elevated CO2, including ours experiments. And what these show is that all of them show evidence for positive CO2 effects on carbon storage when you look at both plant and soil carbon. Some only increase in carbon stored in plants, some only in soil, some both. The dashed line shown here in yellow-orange is the 0 line. Everything to the right means that when you combine soil carbon and plant carbon, the ecosystem is taking up and storing more carbon under elevated CO2. None of them are to the left of that line. And so there is evidence from our experiments that our ecosystems are using more CO2, taking it up and storing it, at least as long as these experiments have gone on. What about storage capacity? Well, as I traveled around the world, I like to find forests that look like this to go hiking in, because I like to go hiking in the very beautiful places like this around the world. But as I get to those few areas that look like this, I pass through a lot more forests that look like this, forests that have been degraded in some fashion, where some trees are dying, the stocking is not very high, the trees aren't very large. So the question is, like, how much of the world really looks like this, and how much could be better stocked, so to speak, to hold more carbon? So I worked again with the Global Forest Biodiversity Initiative, using both the ground-based data from around the world and remote sensing data to try to estimate from existing forests, not growing forests in cities or on agricultural lands, just this existing forest, how much so-called unused potential was there to store more carbon? We came up with this number of 200 to 250 petagrams carbon. Now, if you're like me, petagram is a big number. I have no idea what to think about that number. So if we translate it into climate change, if by 2075 we achieved 1/3 of that unused potential, we would cut additional climate change by 1/6, which is a meaningful bite out of the climate change that might come along. So in essence, we need to take those forests, manage them in a way so that there's greater density of trees on average and a larger, long rotation age, so the trees are larger on average. Certainly very possible in any given stand. Making it happen at a country scale or globally, of course, is a challenge. That's just the carbon in the trees, though. Remember, there's even more soil carbon than there is plant carbon. And in another study I was involved in with Xin-Li Chen, who is a visiting fellow at our institute in Michigan, who's also at the University of Alberta and is now a professor in China. We use Canadian inventory data. If you look at all the dots there on the map, that's where they have long-term soil and plant data. And what we saw is that in these repeated surveys where the Canadian Forest Inventory researchers had gone back and sampled more than once, that on average, the forests that had greater species evenness and functional diversity were associated with 30% increases in organic horizon and mineral soil carbon over 10 years. Again, that's a meaningful change in soil carbon, and it was associated with those forests that were more diverse. So keeping diversity on the landscape probably will help us keep and actually add more soil into our plants and into our soils. Now, we're not the only ones who've been thinking about these things. Many other people have been doing estimates and models and experiments and observations. This is a paper by Girard et al. In Nature 2021, where they looked at the potential to protect, manage, and restore ecosystems in forests grasslands, and agriculture globally on intact lands, working lands, and native cover. And through avoided emissions and enhanced sinks, they came up with enough potential carbon to offset 50% of our annual emissions. Again, do they or we expect us to actually get to 50%? Of course not. But if we get to 10 or 15% even, that's worth doing. Well, what about co-benefits? I started out at the very first slide mentioning that climate regulation is only one nature-based service, so to speak. Actually, your colleagues here at another university in France, up in the mountains, looked at a study in the Alps where they looked about co-benefits, not just climate regulation, but other kinds of services, heat wave mitigation, flood regulation, landslide projection, and monetized it. And they came up with an idea that these co-benefits were very real and effective and brought a 3-to-1 return on the economic investment. And so it's not just doing this for nature to be nice to nature, it actually pays off economically for people as well. Well, what about justice? I started off by saying that I was going to transition somewhere in my talk from a standard ecosystem science talk to thinking about justice. And here I'm talking about in particular justice environnementale et climatique. And here, like one particular kind of nature-based solution has received a lot of bad press, the idea of planting trees, because you can plant trees in places where people don't want them or they have other uses for the land that's more valuable to them and maybe more viable and sustainable. And Nathalie Sedon had a really nice paper in Science 3 years ago that if you're interested, you should go back and look at. She talked about a number of, well, conceptual ideas, but also some very specific projects that tried to simultaneously increase biodiversity, mitigation and adaptation for climate, and livelihoods of local peoples. And she documented some where things can go wrong, where in fact everything went wrong. One example was in Cambodia, an example where they tried to a forest with non-native monocultures without really incorporating the indigenous peoples, and the whole thing went south, didn't work in any respect. Another example was from Uganda, where they tried to reforest for carbon offsetting. Again, it was uncompensated disposition and violent eviction of local people. The project was abandoned. So, you know, often we can talk about trying to do what seems like the right thing, but if you do it in the wrong way, in the wrong place, it has negative consequences for local people as well as for nature, and doesn't do us any good in terms of climate regulation. But she also pointed out in her paper that not everything always goes wrong. She has examples of some win-win-win situations. One was in Bolivia, where indigenous people were given title and control over forest management for 390,000 hectares of ancestral land. That's a large area. And the project so far seems to be associated with avoiding additional CO2 emissions and increased habitat for endangered species, and is increasing sustainable livelihoods. Another example was in Tanzania in a silvopastoral system. So the idea that we can work with local peoples to do things on the land that store more carbon, but also bring co-benefits for people and for nature is something we really need to aim for and has potential. So I've walked us through this summary here. I've walked us through this outline about whether we can enhance quadrillion-dollar service that the land is already doing. Does climate change impact on ecosystem function? Yes, in many, many ways, mostly negative. Impacts on biodiversity? Yes, but we don't really understand them very well. Does it matter? Of course, because biodiversity really does matter for maintaining ecosystem function, and we're going to really need biodiversity to help make natural climate solutions work in any fashion. So I finished with the much longer first part of this talk, but in my journey as a scientist, I've been thinking, like, how do we think about the role of ecology and ecosystems in society more broadly? So I'm thinking about how do we think about what we do on the land as part of the larger set of pathways of decarbonization. The big black arrow there shows what I've been talking about for the past 45 minutes or so. But we also know we need to decarbonize electricity, electrify everything, and increase efficiency to take the rest of the bite out of the apple of climate change that we need to do. And the question is, can we do this? And can we do it justly? So 4 questions I'm going to briefly touch upon here. Is it fair to ask poor countries to contribute to decarbonization? Can emissions be uncoupled from well-being, which is related to the first question? Do the way in which we think about our valuing of investments in fighting climate change, which involves the social cost of carbon, does that amount to future side? And lastly, can we actually slow and stop climate change and save money at the same time? And we talked about a lot of this in a paper we came out with earlier this year that took me 5 years to research and write. So hopefully someone will read it. And we're back to this cartoon where we're really putting society in as part of this system where we're looking at natural and human systems together. So we'll start with this notion of what should we ask poor countries to do, or what should they ask themselves to do? Well, poor countries are much, much more at risk from climate change. If you look at the top red arrow, it's no surprise that emissions are higher in richer countries. That shows the per capita emissions in relation to per capita GDP. But if you look at the bottom arrow, all countries have scarily high future damages from climate change. But the poorer countries, shown on the left part of the axis there, that have low per capita GDP, have staggeringly high 30, 40, 50% expected loss of GDP every year come mid-century. And I guess this is also data from Swiss Re, because their economies aren't resilient. They mostly are in the tropics where climate change is going to be really problematic. And so these countries have really, really a lot to worry about. And so is it fair to ask them to decarbonize? The standard notion is, well, we got rich by burning fossil fuels. How can we ask them not to? Well, I'm saying it's not our job to ask them not to. They should ask themselves not to, because it's actually in their own favor. And this very question actually implies that the path to well-being and prosperity requires inefficient and expensive emissions, which is a standard economic thought, the Kuznets hypothesis, for those of you who are familiar with that. But there's actually not much data supporting that, because alternative energy is getting cheaper and cheaper. So decoupling emissions from well-being is possible. So on the left of the 2 columns here are the set of rising countries with low to medium incomes that still have rising in the last 20 or 30 years emissions because they're burning more fossil fuels. So look at the squiggly arrows going up. At the same time that they're increasing their renewable energy, their GDP is generally increasing, and their Gini coefficient is going down, meaning the income inequality is decreasing. But the countries on the right, about a dozen or so also, that are also low to medium income, are countries that have had falling or stable emissions during most of the last 10 or 20 years. And they've also increased their GDP, increased or improved their income equality, and increasingly used renewable energy. And when people have tried to look at whether or not investing in renewables and decarbonizing actually hurts the economy of developing countries, there's no evidence that on average it does. And it makes sense because renewables are cheaper and cheaper, so it makes sense to use them. So what should we or can we do, and who matters? Which kind of people? Where and when? So this is kind of a gnarly thought here, so I'll try to walk you through it. The way in which countries decide whether to invest in fighting climate change involves our estimates of climate damages in the future, combined with what are called discount rates that drive the so-called social cost of carbon and drive decision-making about economic choices of societies. What this means is that when you decide to spend $1 or $1 million or $1 billion or $1 trillion on solar energy rather than coal, let's say, or on insulating buildings across all of France or China or the US, you have to think about how valuable is that compared to other uses. And the discount rate comes in making the decisions. The discount rate is based on 3 things. One is the presumed wealth of future generations. And the standard economic thought is actually every generation is going to be better off than the past, because that's what's happened in the last 100 years. But as ecologists, we know that you can't necessarily assume the future is going to be the same as the past. But that is what's baked into all the standard economics of Nobel laureates, is that the presumed wealth of future generations means we should leave them to pay for it. Second is opportunity cost. If you spend $1 billion on solar panels, you're not spending it on education or stadiums or something else. The third is social time preference, which, as the name implies, is literally a totally arbitrary economic fudge factor that says that we as people would rather have 25 cents in our pocket now than $1 in our pockets 20 years from now. But it's kind of based on just asking people what they want. And so this discount rate is unbelievably important, but it's actually an unbelievably terrible metric. And it's led to people literally getting the Nobel Prize for saying the discount rate should be 5%. But with a 3% to 5% discount rate, climate damages in 2150 count, meaning we incorporate them in our decision making, less than 1% to as much as 2% as climate damage now. Meaning that in fact, we alive today, using these discount rates, take no responsibility, virtually, for climate damages to future generations, let alone nature in the 22nd century and beyond, which I view as future side. In essence, we're so selfish, like, oh, it doesn't matter, you know, what happens this year counts 100 times more than what happens in 2150. And that's baked into our economic and policy decision making. And I think it's both bad science and it's also morally wrong. But let's leave that moral issue aside for now and just look at the money. Some people still say it's too expensive to do anything about climate change because it will cost a lot of money to stop climate change. But when they say that, they forget the fact that it's going to cost 5 or 10 times more economically in damages if we don't stop climate change. And this, again, is not me as a wild-eyed ecologist saying this. This is data from the world's leading business consultant companies and leading reinsurance companies, that the cost to stop climate change in 20 years would be as much as 2% GDP every year over those 20 years, which is a lot. You know, in a recession, that's a big number. But if we don't stop climate change, we're going to see 5 to 10% or greater damages from climate change every year into the future, not just for 20 years. And so, in a way, this actually gives me hope. We're not going to do the right thing for the right reasons, but greed will eventually cause businesses and governments of the world to take a look at not just the quarterly profits, but what's going to happen 5, 10, 20 years down the road. And companies like Swiss Re and others that really are invested in the long term are going to push the rest of the corporate world and the governments to eventually do the right thing. Will there be all sorts of damages to nature and people along the way? Yes, but I think that we will stop climate change. It just might be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 decades later than we really should have. So the take-home message from my talk today is natural solutions can be part of a broader portfolio that can help us slow and stop climate change. And some of the key takeaways is that there are strong linkages between climate, biodiversity, ecosystem function, carbon, and climate. I didn't talk about albedo, I didn't talk about other things, but those are all wrapped in there as well. And so we can't think about those in isolation, and that we really need to think of slowing climate change and maintaining biodiversity, because coupled together they're win-win, but coupled together, if we don't take care of them, they'll lose-lose in a greater than additive way. To me, one of the things I've really learned in the last dozen years is that climate change impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem function largely involve moisture. There's very, 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 very few evidences that heat waves really kill plants. It's much more that heat waves associated with droughts are killing plants or reducing their agricultural yield or causing wildfires. And so climate warming is really about climate drying. Independent of what happens to rainfall, assuming that rainfall stays the same. In fact, rainfall is getting patchier and falling more in wet seasons and less in the hotter, drier summer seasons. So actually rainfall changes is in conjunction with the effect of warming itself on moisture, a double whammy, because together they're making the world even drier during the driest times of year. The third point here is that biodiversity matters to ecosystem function. It's not just a buzzword. It really matters to the way our systems function. And we know that diversity matters, although government in the United States right now doesn't seem to think so. It matters in the way, you know, a basketball team operates or a corporation works or a university functions. So biodiversity matters in human systems as well as in natural systems and in coupled systems. And lastly, land-based carbon sequestration matters for slowing climate change. It's not a silver bullet, it's not going to solve everything, but we can certainly do some things that slow climate change. And in almost any case, in many cases, we also have many co-benefits for biodiversity for local people, and so it makes a lot of sense. Now, the solutions are all the boring things we've all been hearing about forever. We need to subsidize green agriculture, not brown agriculture, meaning agriculture that's more energy efficient. We need to increase energy efficiency and reduce use in our autos, building, land use agriculture, increase renewables of all kinds, and keep carbon and other greenhouse gases such as methane on land in farms, forests, grasslands, and deserts. And with that, I think, the last question then is, can we enhance the quadrillion-dollar service that lands have played and vegetation, and can we combine it with decarbonization and do it with justice? Well, the answer is yes. There's no technical constraint. In fact, and there's no economic constraints going to be for the better. But will we, of course, is the big question, because we all live in governments in almost every country around the world that don't necessarily make rational decisions on any time basis. And so maybe that's part of our job now as ecologists, is not just to be ecologists, but to work with policymakers and others in the realm politique to actually try to enact useful change. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. And if we have time, I'm happy to take questions.
Hello, thank you for your conferences. I just wanted to ask you a question. In the solution, you told us that increased energy efficiency can be a solution, but for example, road projects, we saw that if we build I don't know, a large piste for the cars, there is like a big rebound effect that can increase emission. And we also see that when we increase the efficiency, for example, of electronics, most of the time we use it more, and so it produces more. So increasing energy efficacy, it is a real solution, or is it just like a risk to reduce our volunteer to lower our emission and lower our consumption, for example?
Great question. With almost any potential solution, there are these risks that when, for instance, if energy becomes cheaper or the auto piece becomes more faster and allows you to go further faster, people use more energy. And so we really need to combine the increased efficiency at a technical level with smart policies, which might be things like carbon tax, which people have talked about and deployed them in some places and then taken them away or reduced them. I don't know if there's ever been carbon tax in France.
Not really yet.
Not really yet. But you can do it with there's a variety of mechanisms. You don't have to have a carbon tax. But yes, there are unexpected consequences of almost everything that we do. And so we need to keep those in mind and figure out how to combine things such as increased energy efficiency with ways that still incentivize people to use less energy, even despite those changes. But it's a real issue. So nothing is easy.
Thank you very much for all the information and everything you explained. You told us not to be just only ecologists, but to work with policymakers and everything. And as biodiversity manager, I was wondering, you told us that biodiversity make the forest more productive, right? So can be an argument, because sometimes the stakeholders that we work with are not always convinced by the importance of protecting biodiversity for biodiversity. Is protecting biodiversity for the forest and for the carbon storage a good argument? What's your opinion about this? Thank you.
yes, but just like the question about energy efficiency, it can't just be a blanket, yes, it's a good thing, because someone who's growing Douglas fir in the Pacific Northwest of the US or loblolly pine can't necessarily grow and harvest and make money growing 10 different species at the same time. But there are ways to start thinking about increasing diversity on the landscape. So maybe rather than 10,000 hectares, that's all a single pine species. You have 1,000 hectares here, or 100 hectares here of one thing, 100 hectares of another species. So there are ways to do it. And I think it is actually a very good argument because, for instance, in places like Canada, where they have over-reliance on a small number of species, often grown in monoculture, they become really overburdened with diseases and insect pests that reduce their productivity. And people have started to experiment with ways of decreasing the density to decrease those diseases. Now, there's probably better evidence that Chinese scientists have actually done a lot of work with crop diversity, even within species, and shown big benefits from that. And so I think we're still in the early days of knowing how to deploy diversity maybe within species as well as across species to increase diversity and its benefits. So I think it is a real strategy you should deploy, but you can't just like use a cookie cutter, we say in America. I have no idea how to say that in French. You can't just use the same exact mold for each very case. You have to think about it in a way. But I think there is a lot of potential to think outside the box. And one of the projects I'm involved with, a large Canadian project, is in Canada, because of things such as wildfires, neither traditional preservation nor traditional industrial forestry are going to work in the future. So they really have to think about something that makes the forest more resilient and resistant to fire, as well as all these other damages from climate change, in a way that is economically viable. So I think we're going to be forced to think outside of the box about these questions. So maybe for the next 5 years, it won't matter as much. But when you think 10, 20, 40 years down the road, it could be a really big deal.
Thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask a question. When you talk about like a generational responsibility, you said that the past of the current generation is not taking responsibility for the future one. But what could be the solution? Usually we think about education, like we need to educate nowadays generation for the future. And I think it was a case for us that, I don't know, in 2010, 2015, there was like a lot of hope and everyone was like, we're going to achieve climate change. And we're seeing date like 2025, 2030, which is nowadays. But we've seen that the issue is like politics are taken by older generation and like the shift is slow. And so what would be like solution to like make it faster? Because if we see education is one good solution, but it takes a long time for our generation or the next one to be like able to apply policies and stuff like that.
If I knew the answer to that question, I wouldn't be standing here in front of you. I'd be somewhere else probably. It's of course, the huge problem is how do we get our system, which is not just government, it's people, it's society, it's corporations, to act on these things in a timely manner. I don't think anyone knows how to do that. And so I think it's going to be all the things you talked about. It's going to be education. It's also going to be economic pressures. It's going to be increasing number of disasters that, even in the United States, we're like moving backwards at warp speed right now, but that can't, well, at least I hope it can't continue forever. We'll retain a democracy, and in the future, we will start to try to reverse what's happening right now. And so I think we have to, I know it's hard because our lives are short and climate change is fast, but we have to take the long view that it's not going to get solved right away. There's going to be uphill, it's going to be downhill, and that at some point in time, I hope that the momentum will change enough that we actually start to really do things more coherently and consistently across the world. That's just a hope. It's not a prediction. But getting back to the premise of your first part, actually is this notion of, for instance, discount rates. It sounds very arcane and very econometric, but it actually is incredibly important because the way in which governments decide how to spend money involves things such as discount rates and in terms of valuing what kind of choices you make with your dollars or your euros today or next year. And so the fact that we use these discount rates, which almost certainly underestimate climate change damages and ignore any of our obligations, which I think we should have to future generations from an economic perspective. I think that if we changed and had discount rates that were zero or negative, or even just 1% rather than 3 or 5, that it would change the way in which it would for sure change the way in which governments chose to do things. And I think that's a case where, as ecologists, we need to be talking to the economists so that, and of course some economists get this, but many mainstream economists are clueless about a lot of these things, which is a very strange state of the world to think about, like, oh, this person got the Nobel Prize in economics for what's nonsense. And so I think our sciences are still needing to be integrated interdisciplinarily in a way that we're not doing yet very well.
So first, thank you very much for this very nice presentation. And I have a question, because you clearly show that diversity is increasing production somehow. But if I can be provocative, I would say that from an engineer point of view, the more complexity you have a system, the more way you have things to go wrong. So I suppose it's stable diversity you are talking about it. And is there any other hidden stuff that explains this increase in productivity that is not logical from an engineer point of view?
So the question sounded like you asked a couple of them, but one was that simply from a conceptual framework, complex systems, there's more things that can go wrong. But I think it really depends on how much redundancy and what kind of network you have in there, right? And so some systems can be engineered in a way that they're complicated, but there's lots of fail-safes built in. And nature didn't do this on purpose, but one of the reasons that systems are more stable under higher diversity is, in fact, that all the players, like all the species, behave asynchronously when the system is quite diverse, and that asynchronicity, if that's a word in English even, enhances stability, because it means that when one player does better, another's probably going to do worse in some sense. And so I think that the mechanisms of biodiversity in natural systems tend to be ones that will make the system more stable and more productive, because it's not like, so I guess if something called selection was the main reason that biodiversity increased productivity, where a super species was present and it did really well, then if that super species does poorly, you're not going to do very well. But if the main mechanisms, which seem to be the case, involve species differing in their traits and in their habits, such that some do better when it's dry, some do better when it's wet, some do better when in shallow rooted, some have deep roots, some do well when it's cold, some when it's warm, that ensures more that someone's going to be able to do well no matter what the conditions are, but also the fact that there tend to be more positive interactions than negative interactions within trophic levels, but especially across trophic levels, also suggests that the greater number of species will tend to make the system more productive. But it's a good question, and I don't think we've really answered. I don't think I've answered your question very well, but it's just kind of my thinking on it.
Good morning. Hello. First, thank you for coming here. My question would be about your presentation seemed to be really about the definition of well-being, really wealth and money centered. Well, we know also that wealthiness and richness is really correlated with carbon emission, actually. So do you think that we miss some information about positive impact putting the money part aside, and what's your thought about that, and thought about how we consider well-being and the correlation between climate change, its impacts, and biodiversity loss? Thank you.
Great. Two really important points there that obviously I went through too fast and didn't come through it entirely. So the first is, and first I didn't really even touch upon, is that GDP per capita is not a very good measure of well-being, although it is actually very well correlated with almost every other measure of well-being, whether it's health, education, happiness, although it's not linear, it plateaus at a certain level. But the other maybe more important one is in the complicated figure I showed of the set of low to middle income countries with increasing carbon emissions and those with decreasing, is that those second countries had decoupled the two so that their well-being, whether measured by health metrics or education metrics or even democratic indices of democracy, were increasing while their emissions were decreasing. And so that's where people have this notion still that in order to increase well-being, you have to burn more fossil fuel. And those countries have, largely by choice, made policies that would increase reliance on renewables in a way that their emissions have gone down, and yet their GDP and other metrics of well-being have increased. So that's where I see there's real hope, is that if you care about women's health or prenatal health or longevity or whatever other measure of well-being you want, in general, those countries are showing increases in those at the same time that they're using less carbon in fossil fuels. And thanks for bringing that up then, because I didn't explain that very well in the talk.
Thank you. Forgive my English. I hope my question is clear. What do you think we could do at really just a citizen level without going to like the regional parliament or the national parliament for this to enhance kind of this usage of the forest that would offset carbon emissions?
Everything you said was clear in English, but I still didn't understand exactly. What was the first part? What can you do as individuals? Is that what you said?
Yes, at a citizen level.
Okay, particularly with respect to the forest.
In this, how can we promote or kind of help go towards this usage of the forest?
Yeah, I think that there's several ways. One goes back to the question over here, is education. When people understand something and integrate it into who they are, they often act differently. Example I give in 15 years ago, people thought gay marriage would never be legal in the United States. For many, many decades, polls had shown the vast majority of people were against it for a variety of reasons. And then, in part because the younger generation across the political stripes actually were realizing that maybe wasn't their vision for humanity, things changed. And so education, or beyond education, kind of social norms can change. And so actually one thing I've been surprised or really interested to see in France is there's very little litter. You know, like why is there not, you go to Latin America or much of the US, there's litter everywhere. So why is there no litter? It's just as easy for a French person to throw something out the window of their car as an American or a Brazilian. It's a social norm, I assume, because you're not going to get caught if you're not going to get penalized, right? And so that's a case where your whole society behaves differently now than some other societies, and it's a value that somehow people here have incorporated into their behavior. So one is this education and social norms. The other is voting. You know, none of our countries are really democracies because of the way in which the system works, but they're quasi-democracies, and our votes still count when it's counted. You know, so as an individual being part of the political situation and system. Now, in the US, many people if you're working on a local forest, being involved in a local city or county government, you know, I was on the environmental commission in our town. You know, that's where decisions are made, like, oh, do we allow this forest to be cut for development? You know, why should we allow it or not? And so that's where having citizens involved at those grassroots level, you know, can make a difference. So
thank you.
Sure. There's a question up there.
Yes, here. Thank you very much for your presentation and your insights. You've touched upon lots of economic and political stakes. And I was thinking about maybe if we try to reverse a bit your initial question and think of how we can actually get inspired by climate change mitigation to enhance our natural protection policy. And I don't know if you're aware, but in the EU right now, there's a sort of like nature credits initiative that they're thinking of implementing, just like we have like carbon credits in a carbon market. So I don't know if there's this in the US or if you've heard about similar initiatives and you can share your opinion.
Yeah, I've heard about them. We don't have them in the US. Like one of the other questions, maybe it was about energy efficiency, and or maybe I was talking to someone earlier today, the reporter maybe. It all depends on how it's done. If it's done well, I think both carbon credits and nature credits make a lot of sense because of all the co-benefits we talked about. And in some senses, you can view them as, you know, they're trying to do the same thing that carbon taxes do. They're just taking a different route to get there. And so I think they make a lot of sense, but they have to be engineered in a way that they actually work and work over the long term.
Thanks for the interesting talk. And I have a question about the last question you had in the presentation, will we? I was wondering, how do you think about the involvement in scientific? Should we, because it seems that we kind of know what we should do, but do you think that scientific should be more involved in the decision making or in the politics and be more active about all the things we know to start the
Yeah, great question, and people like to debate it. And rather than thinking, oh, do the most fundamental scientists also need to be involved in policy and politics, you could reframe it and think about maybe we need a different set of people with scientific training, some at one end of that spectrum that just focus on the science and just try to understand how nature works. But maybe you need people who actually are in government agencies or ministries or in corporations who actually understand the science because it helps them make decisions. In fact, one of the things I've been amazed at is I have a friend and colleague who works for one of the large international consulting companies that consults and advises major corporations, PepsiCo, McDonald's, Nestle, all these, on sustainability. And the chief sustainability officers for most of these companies have MBAs. Did you say that in France, MBA? And they don't know anything about the environment, most of them. And so right there, then and there, there's like, we need MBA courses that are more integrated, that aren't just narrowly a business in the same way they are. And so I think, so we need that expertise, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every scientist needs to also play all these other roles. For those of us who think we would like to, we should, but others should be able to be, you know, just scientists. But we also need that kind of expertise integrated in to people who do law and do energy policy and do medicine and do business. And so that's, I think, where we're failing as universities. I can't speak for Montpellier because I don't know, maybe you're doing it already, but certainly all the universities I know in the United States, we still so compartmentalize everything that we don't do a very good job of training people in these other areas about things that they actually should know in order to do their job better.
I have a question that is linked to this last question, which is, do you still think there is an impact of doing science on climate change, on the changes? Because on one hand, there is much complexity to decipher, and it's really, there are a lot of things we don't understand, but I think we understand enough to know what there is to do. So maybe it's not that impactful to do science and environment.
That's a great question. My wife asks me that all the time. It's like, why do science anymore? Like, we already know all this stuff, you know? And unfortunately, because many other parts of society are very skeptical, and science often can be proved wrong, I think we still do need to understand better. Because, for instance, let's say it turns out that certain kinds of risks, that we lump them all together now, you know, you've probably all seen all these tipping point papers about, you know, we've gone past our global boundaries, which actually I think are highly uncertain. So I think knowing like which boundary we actually have gone beyond, if we have gone, and which one will take care of itself, still is important. So I think maybe your question and my wife's question aren't quite the right one, because we still do need science, but we need more to do something about the science we already know. And that's, none of us are, well, maybe someone in this room is trained to do that. I wasn't trained to do that. And so who is trained to actually take information such as this and help society do better? I don't think we train as many people in that area as we should, and there would be jobs. Like I said, I'm amazed at how many of these chief sustainability officers who make a lot of money have no understanding whatsoever about supply chains or carbon cycling or any of these things.
Thank you once again, Peter, for such a nice talk. I would like to take a thermodynamic perspective. With respect to the thermodynamic, if we believe in the thermodynamic law, energy cannot be created or destroyed, first law. Second law, entropy always increases in some sense. And from a thermodynamic perspective, ecosystem can be seen as an open system that maintains some forced or low internal entropy by exporting disorder in some sense. Do you think that increasing global energy imbalance is fundamentally altering the entropy flow? I think that, and perhaps the capacity of ecosystem to remain stable. Have you think of this in a more physical and thermodynamics perspective?
Could you rephrase the last part? I understand you were saying that systems are naturally going to go to the levels of disorganization.
Yes.
And so the question about climate change was, I didn't quite follow
yes.
that.
Do you think climate warming is changing the ability of ecosystem to remain stable in a thermodynamic perspective?
Yes.
That's my question. And is there any works with respect to this connection with a global thermodynamic view of Earth?
There probably is, but we probably use different words for it in some sense. I mean, you could view, obviously, life by itself is anti-entropy. You know, it's it's working against that, but all life ends and everything. So I think to the extent that climate change will cause these systems to be less functional, less organized, that does mean we're speeding up entropy by doing that. So, so I think there probably are people who have formalized that in using thermodynamic theory in an abstract sense, but probably not try to like simulate. So, did that answer your question?
Yes, okay. Perfectly. Thank you.
On va poser une dernière question.
Sure. Yeah.
Hello, thanks a lot for your talk. I have a bit of a bizarre question maybe, but I'm sorry, I'm a philosopher, so that's what I do. But my question is because I was really hooked about the title of your talk, which was, can we use nature justly to counter climate change? And the question I ask myself is is justice only a thing, like a responsibility between humans, or do we also have a certain responsibility towards natural environments? Namely, I work on glaciers, so an environment that we change a lot and extremely since the last centuries. And I wonder if it could be useful to also incite people to be more responsible towards nature and not to use nature as we want and engineer natural spaces as we want. I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
That's
that would be my question.
Great question. And actually, in the paper I read earlier this year, we had a big section on different kinds of justice, including not just for people, but for nature, and including non-living nature, things like rivers or glaciers and obviously you're a philosopher. This is in the realm of philosophy more than in ecology. And the point is people have thought about this and made claims for what we should be doing or how we should be thinking, or at least how one might think. And I don't think there's fundamentally a right or wrong answer, because I don't think there's even a right or wrong answer within human society. This is just my philosophical view, we decide that we should treat our neighbors or our children well, or maybe evolution has pushed us in that direction. But it's fundamental. There is no abstract, outside of humans, there is no right or wrong. We have a thought about what's right or wrong. And so whether or not we take care of a river or take care of an unborn person a century from now is a subjective decision about how to think about the world. So I don't have an answer, but I think we do, personally, I think we do owe something to non-human entities, whether they're biological or not, but that's just my personal view. And I know there are some actually countries that have put in place some laws like that actually institutionalize the rights of things like rivers for these exact reasons. And I think that's a great thing. But it's complicated, and I have no idea how the law, well, once it's I guess if you put it in law, then it's law, it's not philosophy. So, but I think it's a really fascinating question.
Merci beaucoup.